record like I usually do. We're going to, as I told everybody that we were starting the New Testament.
This is my Jewish group.
Can they see us?
No.
Okay, can everybody see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. 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 Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
But we've been in the end times now for about 2 years. And as I mentioned prior, we've been doing end times really in what I call the expanded Second Temple Jewish time period, because I included Ezekiel into that since he kind of sets up really 40 years before the Second Temple area, but he's the one that predicted what would happen and looks forward to the future. So we've been looking at text in the Old Testament from 600 BC when the Jewish people were taken into the diaspora, and we went through Ezekiel, we went through Daniel, we went through Zechariah, and there's others there, but those are the three main ones that we covered. We spent time in Ezekiel 40 through 48 in the millennium. We just got done now after Malachi writes his book about 430 BC. He's the last of the Old Testament prophets, and then there's no more prophets. And yet there's people writing, and we did a fabulous study on Second Temple Jewish literature that is outside of the Bible, which we would commonly know as pseudepigrapha, apocrypha literature. We looked at Qumran community and the Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus and Philo, even though they get a little bit more into the New Testament times. But now we're ready to jump now with all of that background. Now let's look at the New Testament. So we're going to look at the end times through the eyes of the New Testament prophets. Okay. And as I mentioned, Malachi was the last Old Testament prophetic book to be written. Nehemiah was the last Old Testament historical book to be written, and they were both written around the same time period. It is proposed that the last Old Testament inscription, as I said, was about 430, 425 BC, and the first New Testament event occurred 5 BC with the birth of John the Baptist. Okay, because obviously John the Baptist was born 6 months prior to Jesus. So that leaves about 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, but Malachi leaves us with a thought. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. So the messenger of the covenant, as we know, is going to be the Messiah, Yeshua, and he's going to come to his temple. So is Malachi telling us in 400 BC that he's got to come before the temple is destroyed. Now, he doesn't know the temple is going to be destroyed in 70 AD. So he's got to come before 70 AD. So that was interesting how the Old Testament leads us now into a time period of waiting, okay? Of waiting, okay? And as I mentioned, so much time has elapsed. We do have outside books. We do have the Septuagint, which is an inside book, but it's a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. We have the apocryphal writings. The Apocrypha are 14 books, but the pseudepigrapha after the Dead Sea Scrolls contains 50, 60 books. Okay, Josephus was a historian who was born around AD 37, so he's actually talking later on, and we'll get more into him. We touched a little bit on Josephus, but he's going to kind of give us history after the New Testament. And we have to look at, obviously, now more of the Greek, especially the Roman. We're going to look at the Roman occupation because the Second Temple Jewish literature doesn't touch a lot on Rome. It touches a little bit because Rome really doesn't come into play until about 37 BC. And a lot of the literature, as you notice, was written between, 200 and, AD moving forward. So, based on that, okay, we are looking at Daniel, who gives us a timeline. Okay, in Daniel 2 of the statute, you saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceedingly brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of the image was of fine gold, its chest of arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Another kingdom inferior to you shall rise after you. So obviously Nebuchadnezzar is the gold head. Who knows what the kingdom is after Babylon? And it will be inferior?
Persia.
Correct. And yet a third kingdom of bronze, Doug?
Greek.
Greece.
Yep, which shall rule over all the earth. And there should be a fourth kingdom,
Rome.
Rome.
strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things, and like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all of these. So from history, we know that what Daniel talked about came to be. Okay? And the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, Grecian, Roman, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, no shall there be kingdom left to another people. So again, we have kind of this messianic expectation that there's four kingdoms, and therefore once the Roman Empire takes place, we have again the expectation that, okay, the Jewish people are looking now for their king. There's been four kings that have set themselves up in Israel. We're looking for our king. Okay, and so again, I want you to see just the writers of the Old Testament, they're kind of predicting at the time of what we're going to be studying in the New Testament. There's a succession of kingdoms, there's a messianic understanding, the idea that the Messiah would have a messenger who would introduce him, who would then issue a covenant that would have to happen before the temple's destroyed. So that's kind of pretty cool, okay? And we're going to see that the New Testament will look at the Old Testament and not look at it like the way that Old Testament writers looked at it, and there's a reason. And they're not going to look at it in the same way as the Second Temple Jewish literature looked at it, because the New Testament is saying he's here. Now we just want to prove it. Okay, and they're going to do it within the context of Old Testament writings. They're going to do it in the context of all the Second Temple Jewish writings and the culture and the geography and everything. And I want to have us have a mindset that the New Testament might reposition, might have us look at prophecy a little bit different than anybody else had looked at, but it's very, very Jewish. Okay. So now I want to stop sharing this, and I want you to watch a video that will explain, since we're coming up into Passover, these guys run a ministry and a Bible institute, actually a seminary as well, in Israel called One for Israel. And this is fantastic. So I want to take a look at it. I'll stop it at times. So let me put this down and let me now share my screen again. Okay. Come on. Okay. Why won't that? Here we go. Okay, now can
We can
everybody,
see your screen.
can you see this?
Yes.
Looks like a
Yes.
Seder plate.
For generations, one of the most unifying moments for every Jewish family is sitting together around the Passover table and reading the Haggadah, the traditional Passover booklet setting forth the order of the Passover Seder. But what many times we as Jews miss during the traditional Seder is to wonder, how did we receive the ceremony and what are its origins? Surprisingly, the most ancient historical reference to the Passover meal, with clear indications of some aspects of the traditional Seders, are not found in the Mishnah or the Gemara, but possibly where you least expect to find it, in the New Testament. Yes, this is the so-called Last Supper of Yeshua and his disciples. So, what is the connection between the Seder and Passover? What does the Passover have to do with Yeshua of Nazareth? What other mysteries are present in plain sight on the Seder table, just waiting for the Jewish people to discover them? Come, we have saved you a seat at the table. I'm here with Dr. Seth Postel and Dr. Golan Broshi, and we would like to discuss the Passover story with you. So I'll start with quoting Professor Israel Yuval of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, that claims that the current Passover Seder tradition includes many ceremonies and stages that have been adopted from the ancient Jewish disciples of Yeshua.
I'm going to probably stop it and comment as we look at this. Erez is the president of One for Israel. They're going to do a discussion with two professors from One for Israel, and they're going to bring up a lot of Jewish sources. So I just want you to be, just take note of that. They're going to quote Jewish sources to prove the point that, in a sense, what he's going to say is what we know a lot about the Passover and the Haggadah and everything about the Passover. We don't know much about it, but the New Testament gives us so much information that this might be the source of all the Passover Seders afterwards. So it's a pretty cool premise. Okay, let's continue.
The Messianic Jews of old. How did Professor Yuval get to this? Where do we see Yeshua in the traditional Passover Seder?
Yep. So actually, I have the article in front of my eyes, the article that he wrote many years ago. And he said, after the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people were left with two narratives, two competing narratives. What do you do with redemption under the Roman occupation? What do you do with it with this Passover? What do you do with the holiday? So two competing narratives, and he says the former one was the messianic. The later one, as a response, was the rabbinic Seder. But
Very
the former,
interesting.
yes, this is amazing.
It's interesting, actually, too, that the first actual mention of a Passover Seder in Jewish sources is the New Testament.
Absolutely.
So Professor Yuval actually says that the first mention is the Last Supper. He calls the Last Supper the first mention of the Seder after Exodus 12.
Okay, what he's saying here is after the temple's destroyed, you have basically just two groups left in Judaism. Everybody else is gone. You have now what we would call rabbinic Judaism, and you have Messianic Judaism. And what this professor at One for Israel is reading a paper from a Jewish professor at one of the universities in Israel that says the New Testament ideas and writings about the Seder come way before the rabbinic ones. So they came first, and then the rabbinic ideas came afterwards. So what he's saying is it very well might be the traditions of our Passover Seder is coming from the New Testament. Isn't that pretty cool?
12th chapter.
So we should start calling it the First Supper.
So is there anything on the table in this symbolic meal,
I think it's being rewound.
I think when he muted himself, he muted the video. Mitch.
Mitch, we can't hear you. Can't hear your PC.
you put half of it back in.
Thank you.
And then you put the other half in a different bag. And that different bag, now this half a matzah is called the afikomen. And it's hidden. And after the meal, the children need to find it. And whoever finds it gets a reward. Do you guys think that symbolizes anything or hints us for anything?
You know, I know that there's all sorts of attempts to explain what in the world the three matzahs mean. There's no question that, and I think the biggest question always ends up is why is the middle matzah broken and buried? And what is pretty spectacular is the fact that, you know, you would expect that after the meal, the service is over. You know, you're tired, right?
Sure.
But it's actually the end of the meal becomes sort of almost the focus.
Celebration.
The celebration and the dessert of this afikoman that you're eating together. You take from one afikoman, it's distributed among the people. You take it with the third cup. I mean, it's
Shouting
hard.
it, right?
It's hard not to see, you know, one of the central ceremonies, one of the central memorial meals for Messianic Jewish faith or Christian faith in the Seder ceremony.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And again, Professor Yuval saying the epikoman, the after the meal, says this is exactly what he says Messianic Jews saw as Yeshua's second coming and revealing himself to Israel. And there's no wonder that the rabbis also, maybe, as he said, picked it up. Yeah, picked it up and tried to steal it. Yeah.
I think in Luke, it talks about a cup. He took a cup, right? It says in verse 17, the same chapter. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he said, take this and share it among yourselves. For I say that I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until the kingdom of God comes. And then he had taken some bread and given thanks. Okay. It's interesting here, a cup before and a cup after dinner. I always remembered the way that the Passover meal unfolds is by the order of the cups, right? And so you can really see within the Gospels, there is an order of cups. Interestingly enough, and I find this to be very fascinating, after they'd sang a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Well, you know, we actually know what he sang. It wasn't Amazing Grace, right? It was the Shirei Hallel.
Right.
It was the Hallel Psalms, which
Uh,
begins in, what is it, Psalm
1
113, I think?
13 to 118. I
To
think.
118. Now, what's really interesting is that means the last Psalm on Jesus' lips before he goes to
That's right.
Golgotha is the stone which the builders have rejected
It
has become the chief cornerstone.
That's right.
And so we actually know that, we even know the Psalms that Jesus was singing with his disciples that evening before he went to the Garden of
Amazing.
Gethsemane.
Amazing detail. And Golan, you wanted to say a word about the Epikomen. Why do we have a Greek word in our Passover Seder?
Yes, so scholars try to find, and they say the rabbis were stuck ben apatish lasadan, between
The rock and a hard place.
Rock in a hard
yeah,
place. Good, yeah.
they had to refer to the messianic Seder, and they were influenced from the Greek symposium, they say. So some scholars say the Afikoman was a name of a celebration of the Greeks after the party, and that's where it borrowed a Greek word into the Hebrew Haggadah, the rabbinic Haggadah. But what's interesting is the Afikoman, you eat it after it was hidden, it was found. Each of the members of the table is taking kazait, like a small portion,
piece.
and have to eat it, almost saying, "This is my body."
Yeah, so this is shared.
This is shared, exactly.
Shared between
All the participants, and then they even say zecher lekorban Pesach.
A memorial, a remembrance of the Passover sacrifice.
Yeah, before eating it. You can't get clearer than that, right?
So the Passover, the representation of the Passover lamb is shared between everybody, like the peace offering, and then the following step is praise, and the last one is called nirtza, accepted.
Accepted, yeah.
So you celebrate the fact that the sacrifice is accepted once and for all. That's a beautiful, beautiful picture to the sacrifice of the Messiah.
Amen.
I think also the fact that you actually have the Greek there actually then shows that, that the Passover Seder and some of the things that developed in the time of the Second Temple period, right? In other words, which does make a direct connection, or at least, a connection to Jesus in the time that he celebrated with his disciples.
Okay, so this is a good point. In my grandfather's Haggadah, that it's called the Haggadah, and it was very famous. It has a lot of illustrations, and it was produced in the 1800s by some French Jewish artist, still sold today. And it's interesting because it's making a point that one of the most famous things that we do in the Jewish Seder, the Jewish people don't know why we do it. We have 3 matzahs, we take one out, we break it, we wrap it up, we bury it, we bring it back, and then we eat it. So the 3 matzahs, as Dr. Postel said, there's all sorts of understanding in different homes of what the 3 could be. It could be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some rabbis will say that it represents the people of Israel, the Kohanim, the Levites, and Ka'ol Yisrael, the people of Israel. But this whole idea of what we're doing, breaking it, hiding it, and bringing it back, and then eating it, we don't know why we do it. So again, they're explaining that, okay, we know Afikomen is Greek. It's not Hebrew, so we know it came during Second Temple Jewish times. Okay, so again, validating the fact that this might have originated with the disciples. Why? Because we don't have any writings of a Passover meal or Seder. I think the earliest Passover Haggadah written was like 600 AD. So we are now trying to figure out why we do things in Judaism, and the earliest records that we have for any type of order of a Passover Seder is in the New Testament. which is pretty cool.
Hmm.
And what they're saying here is maybe some Jewish scholars will say, nah, it doesn't really show Jesus and all of that. That's kind of made up. But there's a Greek idea that you eat a piece of matzah or bread at the end of a meal or celebration as a way of remembering what you did as kind of an extra celebration. So what he was saying is the Jewish people now might have an idea that when we do the Afikomen, we're remembering the fact that it remembers what the Passover lamb was. Back at the time of Jesus, the Afikomen would have been maybe that extra celebration because they ate the Passover lamb. Today, we eat the Afikomen in remembrance of the fact that we don't eat any more Passover lambs. So it does represent the lamb, and that's what they're trying to point
So-
out. Any discussion on this aspect before we go back?
Are they kind of, from the Jewish perspective or the rabbinical perspective, are they saying that basically this is an influence from Hellenistic Judaism?
Yeah, because it's Greek. So now they're trying to figure out, why do Jews do it? We know that it came at the time of Second Temple Judaism because it's the only time Jewish people spoke Greek. So the question is, why are we doing this?
Right.
So they're trying to
Wow.
relate it to Hellenistic culture, where obviously the New Testament is going to give us a little bit different understanding of it.
Right.
Again, the idea that it came at the time of around when Jesus and the disciples lived is a pretty good indicator that maybe the disciples brought this in. Why? I think so, because this ceremony deals with the two major aspects that are going to be a barrier to Jews back then coming to know Jesus and the barrier of today. The fact that Jesus was the Word that became flesh, and the fact that he died, was buried, and rose again. Okay? Those two things are a huge stumbling block to Jewish people. So it doesn't surprise me that the Jewish people brought this into the Seder, because it perfectly describes who Jesus is and what he did.
Right.
And
Mhm.
what Dr. Erez proposed, just like the Christian church, I don't think most Christians believe that Jesus was born on December 25th, but why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? Anybody know?
Isn't it a pagan holiday?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things going on, but it's the winter solstice, and I think what they try to do is take something that was more pagan and make it more Christian, okay?
Was it the Feast of Dedication at that time?
I'm not exactly sure. I know that there's a whole bunch of different ideas of what that date is, but the church took that date and said it's ours, and we're going to make it ours instead of yours. And they're making the same position that, okay, there's so many Jewish people doing this, we can't take it out of the Seder. We're just not going to tell the whole story. And to be honest with you, if you asked 100 Jewish people why we do that, I don't think any Jewish person could tell you why we do it. We just don't. We just do it.
Hey, Mitch.
I can't, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
Wait.
lady.
I couldn't help, or I can't help but think the three pieces of matzah represent the Trinity. The one that gets hidden is Jesus, because he gets buried and he rises again.
Right, that's what I just said, that the disciples, I believe, came up with this whole thing
Yeah.
to show who Jesus is and what he did. And then later on, Rabbinic Judaism took this and said, nope. But when all Jewish people do it, and when a lot of Jewish people don't believe in Jesus, then the question is, why are we doing it?
Hmm.
So in the Jewish home, the reason why we did it got lost. We don't know why we do it today, but we don't remember why we
Right.
originally did it. Obviously, as a Messianic Jew, we know exactly why we do it.
Right. And to take it out calls more attention to it.
Well, they probably thought so because maybe this became such a huge tradition that they couldn't stop it. Okay, and that very well could be. Again, if you notice, there's no drinking of wine in the Bible for Passover. So when did that come in, and who initiated that?
Mm.
Okay,
Was it New Testament?
we
Was
don't
it in the
know.
New Testament?
Well, it was
Bill.
established, it was at least established by Christ's last Passover.
Well, we know there's a couple of order. According to Luke, we know he's drinking 2 cups of wine. Was there 4 cups? We don't know, but we know that there's 2 cups. We know they sang songs. We know that probably they washed their hands, and in this case, he washed their feet. So we know a couple of things that's going on. We know that there's a meal of the Passover, the Pesach lamb, between the first cup and the second cup. Because in the Gospel of Luke, it says, and after dinner, they took the bread and they took the wine. So we have some type of order. When it was initiated, we have no idea. The New Testament is it's the oldest Jewish book that tells us about the Passover Seder. It's amazing. Okay, let's go.
Like when
Okay.
in a similar
Hey.
way that Ezra and
Hey,
Nehemiah and their
Sorry, go ahead. Angel, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. I went to a real Orthodox Seder one time. One of the girls in my women's Bible class, she worked for Walmart cybersecurity, and there are people like the best hackers in the world work there. And there was a Jewish man named Jeffrey. He was from Washington, D.C., and he invited the 2 of us over for Passover. So he and his wife, literally, we were at the table from like 6:30 until like 1 o'clock in the morning. And I kid you not, he made me drink an entire gallon or whatever it was, like a half a gallon or a 2 liter of grape juice. I told him, I said, listen, it's not religious reasons. I just don't drink. And because they were going to serve wine. And so he said, no, I'll take care of it. So he got one of these, like, it was so beautiful though, but I drank so much. I've never had that much grape juice all in one setting, but it was so beautiful. Just the way that they did everything. It was so beautiful. But I mean, honestly, we were at the table for almost 7 hours.
I
6
know, and
hours.
if you're a kid, guess what you're doing most of the time when it was
Drinking just to survive it.
Exactly. All right, let's continue.
spoke Aramaic, and that was a spoken language. In Second Temple period, Greek was actually the word and the culture that was connecting people. It seems like it's safe to say, and even non-messianic Jewish professors have said that the Last Supper is actually one of the first indications for a Passover meal, the order of the meal. So I want to read a verse from Luke chapter 22 and ask a question, and it's Luke 22 verse 8. So Jesus and Peter and John saying, go and prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it. What does it mean to prepare the Passover?
Yeah, well, if you look at the Last Supper, like for instance, there was sop on the table, right? So the dipping of the sop after, the man who will betray me is the one with whom I dip the sop. And so the whole notion of Seder is an order, okay? It was a meal that had a ceremony. Luke mentions the cup before, the cup after, so there obviously were definite preparations that went into getting ready for a ceremonial meal, which then Yeshua explains is about him.
And Yeshua tells his disciple to prepare, right? Prepare the Passover.
I'm sure each one of us have done several congregational or bigger circle type Passover Seders, and there's all those preparation. I mean, you have to prepare the matzahs in a certain way, the Passover, the cups for the wine, and many of those things. So,
there's also preparation before, right? So Paul actually in 1 Corinthians 5, he talks about the biul chametz, the getting rid of the leaven, right? And so obviously the whole preparation even beforehand of making sure that there was no leaven whatsoever.
Right. And what's the main thing that had to be prepared that Jesus is referring? What's the main thing that, in rabbinic Judaism is not talked about? What's the main thing to prepare? I think the Shangbone is hinting on it. Exactly. Exactly. The lamb itself. I mean, that's the Passover lamb that is slain. And back then at the temple.
Yeah,
Very
it's a little bit ironic that today, at least in our family, they put a pulke, a leg of a chicken, right? They got rid completely of the lamb, any hints of the lamb. Professor Yuval and others are mentioning that Moses appeared one time in the whole Haggadah, and he says it's a deliberate attempt to say we don't need a mediator. We got the Torah directly, we got the commandments directly from God. No Aaron, no Moses. Moses, the hero, one time in the whole Haggadah. And Professor Yuval said it's deliberately because they want to get rid of the necessity of a middleman, a metavech. Yeah. Interestingly, we said that the Passover lamb is our korban, is our sacrifice. Yeah. So Professor Breuer, a different professor, Mordechai Breuer, asked.
Okay. Another point. They're going to get now into the whole sacrificial system stuff and everything, but he makes a point. You hear very little about Moses on Passover, even though in the Bible, Moses is front and center, and the Haggadah and the whole service, Moses, like he said, mentioned once, because it's what God was doing, okay? What he's saying, though, is there might have been a deliberate attempt to take Moses out so that you could make a case that, oh, well, if Moses is very prominent in the Haggadah, in the Jewish Passover Seder, then the Messianic Jews who focus in on Jesus, oh, okay, so Jesus, the Messiah, is a greater Moses, which is actually very Jewish. So again, and we can't prove this, but maybe the rabbis decided, let's take Moses out so that we don't need a mediator. Therefore, there's no grounds for those Messianic Jews to say Jesus fits into everything because he's our new mediator. Okay?
Question, and he's a religious professor, Jewish religion. He asked, wait a minute, the Passover lamb couldn't be a sacrificial lamb. There was no, you take the blood and you put it on the post, but where's the sacrificial lamb? It's not a sacrificial lamb, allegedly. But then Breuer said, there's two hints from Exodus, the 12 chapters, the 12th chapter, the Passover lamb was actually a sacrificial lamb. And he says two things. It says on Exodus 12:5 that it has to be an innocent lamb, 1 year old. And the second hint, it says you have to eat it all and burn it all and eat it exactly like the priests are commanded in Leviticus. So he said, after all, a religious professor, he says the Passover lamb is a sacrificial lamb that is, it's like a forecast of that sacrificial lamb.
Okay, third point, very, very good. Because you could make a case that if Jesus is called our Passover lamb and he died for our sins, the argument against Jesus connecting himself to sin and the Passover lamb is not valid because we don't basically see what the Passover lamb did. The Passover lambs weren't sacrificed for sin. They were sacrificed so that the blood would be put on the door frames and the messenger of the Lord would come in, see the blood and pass over. But again, now he's saying, but there's rabbinic scholars who say not so fast. It is used as kind of a protection, but the fact that Exodus says it must be a year old, must be without blemish, and you must eat it all, connects it to more of this sacrificial lambs that are going to be slaughtered in the sacrifices of Leviticus and in the temple. So he's saying that might not be the most valid point, that even though the blood shielded us from the death of the firstborn, don't be so fast to not think that it could also take away sin. Okay, another good point.
Like John the Baptist said when he saw Yeshua, right?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, and maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later about, the whole connection actually between Passover as a redemptive sacrifice. I mean, what Golan shared is actually very interesting because we actually see prophets later reading Exodus chapter 12 in that light.
But, and a different professor, Buyarin, Professor Daniel Boyan says, not only there's two competing narratives, said both narratives believe in the Logos. Said the Messianic has the Logos figure as the Messiah. But the rabbis have their own Logos. Says it's the oral law. So each of the two movements, Jewish movements, find their Logos in the Passover story in the Bible. We find Yeshua in the Old Testament. They find the oral law in the Old Testament. But Boyarin said both Judaisms believe in the Logos. Which one is the true biblical Logos? That's the question. And I think the Passover shows that only Yeshua can be the true Passover lamb and the Logos, the real Logos.
Well, super interesting. So we can say that both biblical as well as historical sources confirm that the Passover Seder has not only deep messianic meaning, but also roots. And so, you want to say something about it?
Actually, if you're talking about the roots, so this is amazing because rabbis and the Apocrypha, Sfarim Chitzoniyim, Apocrypha, they saw Genesis 22 with Isaac and Abram as the Passover rehearsal, if you can say. So in verse 2, God is commanding Abram to take his only son, Isaac, and then verse 6, and this is amazing. Verse 6, it says, Abram put the wood on Isaac. And Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, and Midrash, I don't know how you say Midrash in English, a rabbinic commentary, ancient rabbinic commentary said, Isaac looked like a man carrying up his cross to the Haggadah, to the place. Yeah. So Isaac appeared as a man taking up his cross. Now, in verse 9, it says that Abram tied Isaac really, he tied him to the altar. Akadoto, yeah, he tied him. And it says, the Midrash Tanchumai, a different Midrash, rabbinic Midrash says, why did he tie them so strong? Because Isaac said, Daddy, I want you to tie me strong so when you kill me, I wouldn't move and break a leg. Because if I break a leg, I wouldn't be kosher. Exactly, for the sins of Israel. This is Midrash Tanchuma. This is a rabbinic Midrash. Isaac is saying, bind me tightly so I wouldn't break a bone. And of course, it's now when he says break a bone, it goes back to Leviticus, Exodus 12:46, when he says the Passover lamb should be with no broken bones. And of course, John 19:36 says that's a messianic prophecy that was fulfilled in Yeshua, but it's not entirely, it's not over yet. It says that the binding of Isaac was in a very specific day, on the 14th of Nisan. Interesting. In the Masoretic text, it says on Mount Moriah. In Sefer Yuvalim, the Book of Jubilees, it says it was on the Mount of Zion, where the temple is. So Abram is taking Isaac, and Isaac is taking up his cross to the Holy of Holies to be slaughtered for the sins of Israel. And it says Israel were celebrating 7 days, exactly in the date of Passover, the binding of Isaac. All in the Book of Jubilees. In the fourth.
Okay, let's stop here because the tradition is that Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac on Rosh Hashanah, and that's why we blow a shofar. He's bringing up something now from the Book of Jubilees, which is now part of Second Temple Jewish literature that says, not so fast. We might think that Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac on Passover. Now remember, this is before Passover. So Moses doesn't come till 500 years later, but that on the 14th of Nisan, Abraham goes up and takes Isaac. Now what's fascinating is that you pick your lamb on the 10th of Nisan, and it took them 3 days to go from when Isaac was picked to Mount Moriah. Then they wait a day, and then he's being sacrificed. So you could make a really good case that Isaac was picked as the Passover lamb way before the Passover lambs were picked and way before Jesus was picked. And where's he being sacrificed? Up on Mount Moriah, which is where the temple's going to be later on, which is going to be where Jesus was sacrificed. And the book of Jubilees says that Abraham celebrated it for 7 days, which was interesting because it's the 7 days that would refer to later on of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Fascinating stuff, you
I have
know?
a question.
Yeah.
Does Judaism see, in symbol at least, Isaac resurrecting because God provided a lamb?
They do. There's a rabbinic tradition that you can use the ashes of Isaac during Yom Kippur. And maybe when we come to that later in the fall, we can investigate that a little bit more. But there's a lot of different discussions about, did Isaac die and come back to life? Was he gonna take this, the sins? What was he asked to do? Because again, Abraham was asked, take your son and your only son and offer him there as a free will offering. Well, what did Abraham know about a free will offering if the Bible, the Torah, hadn't even been written yet? So
Right.
The fact that he wasn't just sacrificing Isaac as some type of pagan ritual. God specifically says, go sacrifice him as an offering, as a sacrifice, a korban, which is the Hebrew word. And so they're making a tremendous connection that I've really never made before. And I think that's what made me wanted to share it with us today, is that the Passover seems to go pre-Moses almost all the way back to Abraham. One point that they don't bring up that I saw too is that we've studied it before in different passages, where in Genesis chapter 18, remember the story when the 3 men go visit Abraham? And Abraham
argues for Sodom.
He
save
argues
Lot.
with Sodom and Gomorrah, correct? And the interesting thing is Abraham served him milk and meat, which is fascinating. But the rabbinic commentators and even Rashi makes a note that when the 2 angels go down and visit and stay in the house of Lot, you know what Lot makes them? He serves them unleavened bread. And some of the commentators think that Lot kind of did a pre-Passover celebration with the 2 angels, which is, again, fascinating and maybe connecting Abraham much more to Passover than I had even kind of thought about.
Of Nisan.
So that's a tradition that precedes the time of
200
Yeshua.
BC.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, is that, it almost at first sounds, wow, where are they getting this? It seems like they're kind of dressing on the text, very strange things. But then you actually start to read the story of Abraham. And for instance, there's a famine in the land in Genesis 12, verse 10. He goes down and he tells his wife, make sure that, that you tell them that you're my sister, because they'll kill me and they'll let you live. And then she's taken, and then God puts plagues on the house of Pharaoh, and God redeems him or releases them, and they come up out of Egypt with the riches of Egypt, gold and silver. And
Sounds familiar.
well, it sounds familiar because in you have this principle of Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, the deeds of the father assigned to the sons. And so when you start to actually trace Abram's steps down to Egypt and out of Egypt, you actually do realize that in an intentional way, Abraham's life does in fact foreshadow things to come. So you would almost, just based on seeing the parallels between Abraham coming out of Egypt and Israel coming out of Egypt, you'd want to say, I wonder what Genesis 22 actually means. And in other words, it invites that kind of a reading.
This is amazing, because what Professor Yuval is saying in his article, that the way Luke in Acts portrayed Peter released from jail was Peter as Israel. Peter with the language, he says the language is taken from Exodus 12, the language of Peter released from the jail. So Luke is portraying Peter as Israel. Again, showing the interaction between the two Seders, the rabbinic one and the messianic one.
So this is super interesting to think about the life of Abram foreshadowing the Exodus, foreshadowing the Messiah himself. So are there any passages that we can think that supports the messianic interpretation of the Passover?
Absolutely. So this is a big issue. So I remember talking to an ultra-Orthodox Jewish guy, and he really came after me, said, the New Testament says, that Jesus is the Passover lamb that takes away the sin of the world. He said, well, that's nonsensical, because the Passover was not a sacrifice for sin. Right. And so what's really interesting, and again, I'm going to kind of get to this in a very roundabout way. So what's amazing is that when you start to look at the way that the prophets describe redemption, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Hosea, whenever they're speaking about the future and future redemption, they almost automatically by default describe the first Exodus as a picture of future redemption. Even in Zechariah chapter 14, when the Lord comes and steps on the Mount of Olives, how does he rescue them? He splits the mountain in two. He splits the mountain in two, and they pass through the middle of the mountain like the splitting of the Red Sea. Now, where is this all going? If you look at Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, on many occasions, Isaiah makes a direct connection between future redemption and the Exodus. And perhaps one of the most significant passages in all of Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 55. Scholars call Isaiah 40 through 55 Isaiah's new Exodus. Now, what you have there is a picture of future redemption, where God would ultimately redeem Israel, not just from the captivity, a physical captivity, but a captivity from what? For their sins. How did they end up in exile? Because of their sins. One of the key figures in Isaiah's new Exodus is a servant of the Lord. 4 times on 4 different passages, Isaiah chapter 42, 49, 50, 53, or the end of 52 and 53, you have what's called the servant songs. Now, we talked about the Seder, the Haggadah, no reference to Moses. It is so sad, because the key to the redemption that Isaiah describes is Passover redemption. And again, he describes Israel coming out like a Passover, like going out of Egypt. The key to this redemption is the servant of the Lord. The servant of the Lord is primary in bringing Israel out of captivity, not just physical captivity, but captivity for their sins. In other words, the centrality of a new Moses. Now, along those lines, I would love to read something, okay? As you get towards the end of Isaiah's new Exodus, Isaiah chapter 52, I'm going to read a few verses that are remarkable. So it says in Isaiah 52, verse 10 and following, the Lord has bared his holy arm, right? The Lord redeemed Israel with his holy arm, right? In the sight of all nations, all the ends of the earth may see the salvation of our God. That seeing the salvation of our God, that's exactly the words of God to Moses, right? The Egyptians will see the salvation, okay? I think that's in Exodus chapter 14. Then in verse 11 of chapter 52, depart, go out from there. Again, get out of there. Exodus language, touching nothing unclean. Go out of the midst of her, purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of the Lord. Verse 12, listen to this. But you will not go out in haste. That word haste, chipazon, it's only used 2 other times. Only used 2 other times. It's used in Exodus and it's used in Deuteronomy to describe Israel departing Egypt in haste. This is going to be a better Passover. This is going to be a better redemption. You will not go out in haste. Why? Nor you'll go as fugitives, for the Lord will go before you. exactly as God led the people of Israel out of Egypt, he went before them, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. Once again, allusions to the Passover. But here's what I find to be most remarkable. All these allusions come from Exodus 12, 13, and 14. In other words, the reference to chipazon, coming out in haste, that's Exodus 12. So you could actually say that I know where Isaiah, as he was writing this passage, I know where his Bible was open to. Exodus 12, 13, 14. Why is that significant? The height, the crescendo of this new Exodus is the introduction of the servant of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13. Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Then he starts to describe the death of the servant of the Lord and how will he die? It's really amazing. It says in verse 7 of chapter 53, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb, say.
Of course.
Say is a Passover lamb, right? Like a lamb that is led to slaughter and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. Wait a minute, why does he die? It already tells us. Verse 5 in the same chapter, he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. In other words, you could say, how careless of the New Testament authors to say that the Passover lamb who dies for Israel's redemption is an offering for sin. Well, let's then put the blame on Isaiah. 700 years before Jesus said, how careless Isaiah was to call this new Passover lamb a lamb that dies for the sins of the nation. John was not being careless. He was not forcing a Christian view on he was being a careful reader of the Hebrew Bible. He had already seen that Isaiah connected these dots. And so this whole notion of this Passover lamb dying for the sins of the world and a messianic interpretation of the Passover lamb comes right from the book of Isaiah.
Wonderful. Man, wonderful. And actually the Exodus, the better Exodus with God going before and after, we also see that in Revelation chapter 12,
Absolutely.
when the remnant is escaping. So, but maybe that's for another discussion.
So Dr. Pastel does a wonderful job of connecting the imagery of Exodus 12, 13, and 14, right before he talks about the suffering Lamb of God in Isaiah chapter 53. And a lot of us, because it's for sin, connect that more to Yom Kippur than we would do for Passover. But he's saying, nah, not so fast. Isaiah wants us to connect it to the Passover. That the first Passover, we sinned, we were put down as slaves, and then it took 400 years for God to take us out, and he redeems us through the blood of the Lamb. The greater Exodus later on that Isaiah writes about through the Messiah, again, will look like the redemption coming out of Egypt, but this one very specifically is going to be for sin. So he says when the New Testament writers do that, we're not acting out of character. We're acting very much in line of a lot of the prophets that have come before, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah. They all did the same thing that the New Testament writers do. So when we go through the New Testament, I want you to understand that what the writers are doing, connecting it to Jesus is new, but connecting it to the Messiah and Passover and redemption and all of that, not new. And we have every right to believe that they were working within the Jewish structure of hermeneutics.
Actually, though, it's really interesting. If you look at the book of Revelation, you look at the way that God puts plagues.
Yeah,
There's
lot of
plagues,
parallels,
and there's
no
the song
question.
of Moses, and he
Yes.
brings his people to
Yes.
the desert,
Mhm.
right? And you've got this victory over the Antichrist, who's like this new Pharaoh. So even there,
There we go.
what you see remarkably is that the Passover isn't just fulfilled in Jesus' first coming.
Exactly.
The Passover
He's
and the
also
and
portrayed, yeah.
Exodus, there's still aspects of the first Exodus that are still pointing forward to a future redemption.
To be continued.
To be continued, exactly.
That's really good. So in connection to that, actually, it's good we mentioned Pharaoh. I want to ask this: why did Pharaoh specifically wanted to destroy the males, all the males?
So biblical scholars are this is an enigma for them. They don't understand. If you want to wipe out the Jewish people, a nation, why only the men? Why only the boys? Why only the baby boys? If you want to do a good job, why the
Adult males?
And not only that, the women, because it takes, let's say you try to murder all the boys, but one survived. It takes only one to make a lot of women pregnant. But what if you try to wipe out the women? If one woman survives, it's much harder. So if Pharaoh wanted to wipe out the Jewish people for generations, he should have wiped out the baby girls, not the baby boys. But why the baby boys? So a hint is actually in Exodus 1:2, but that's a small hint. A bigger hint comes later. A hint, it says, and a man of the tribe of Levi took a woman and a child was born. Whoa, wait a minute, child? What does a specific child named Moses has to do with anything? But then Josephus, in the Iniquities of the Jews, it's called Kadmoniot HaYehudim.
The Antiquities
of the Jews. I think it's book 2, chapter 9. It says that wise men came to Pharaoh and told him, a king of the Jews is born, and he's going to take you out, Pharaoh. He's going to take you out. So you better take him out first. And that's why Pharaoh didn't want to kill just everybody. He wanted a specific messianic figure. And Moses, he was looking for a specific, but he said, okay, so wipe all the male. But he was looking, as Josephus says, for Moses. And of course, it reminds us.
Exactly. Does that remind us? What does it remind you of?
Herod.
There
But
we go.
what's really interesting here? And once again, that brings us back to the story of Abraham going down to Egypt. He actually was afraid that they would kill me, the male, and let you, the female, live. In other words, even Abram foreshadows Moses.
Yes.
Foreshadows
Yes.
Moses, and Moses then foreshadows Jesus. And this is all from a careful reading of the text. In other words, we're not playing with the text. We're actually reading that this is how the Hebrew Bible connects the dots.
This is why peace scholars like Professor Yuval are saying that the Haggadah is trying to hide a little bit, hide Moses, because of course Moses would point out to Yeshua. That's the last thing they want in the Haggadah.
I want to ask questions that are a little different now, maybe a little more of a personal nature. So maybe you can take a moment and just describe how was Passover celebrated in your family of origin before you became a follower of Yeshua. So how was that for you?
Well, in the kibbutz, there was a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing was that what the chalutzim, the Jewish pioneers that escaped Europe and they wanted to create a new Israeli, a new kind of a man, a new man. So they skipped over 2,000 years of rabbinic tradition and went back to the Bible. So the holidays were really, really big thing in the kibbutz. Secular, completely secular, but at least there was a big emphasis on the holidays without keeping the oral law, without being religious. So we used to love the holiday, but of course, I never knew what the actual message of the holiday is. Just okay, so we used to say in the kibbutz, what represents all the Jewish holidays? They try to kill us, we win, let's eat. Yeah, that's it. That's the. But when Yeshua saved me,
Wait with that.
okay.
I want to hear first about how it used to be. How about you, Seth?
So, for me, growing up, Passover was an amazing time. I think, it was an opportunity to go to Brooklyn. I grew up in New Jersey, but we would go to Brooklyn to my aunt's house, and my grandmother would, I don't know how long she'd be cooking, but she'd be cooking for forever, and we would have her homemade gefilte fish. I'm sorry to turn your stomach, right? Gefilte fish and chopped
Food
liver,
traditions
and
are the best.
exactly potato kugel, and one of the most vivid memories I have, and this will connect afterwards to one of the most startling things or amazing things I saw after I came to faith. one of these, my grandfather, Gentle Ben, he was actually, he was huge. He was very, very muscular, and he was a truck driver, and he was incredibly strong. And I remember in Passover at the time of the washing of the hands ceremony, right? And he would take a towel and he would, my big, strong grandfather, and he would put a towel over his arm and he would go every single person around the table and serve us. And he would wash our hands. He would pour the water and he would dry. And I just remember that's an image that's burnt into my mind forever, is this amazing man of strength becoming a servant and serving the whole family.
Well, my experience is a little bit like yours. We would go to my grandparents' house, and usually my grandfather would call me earlier because I was the oldest grandson. And so we would sit together and we'd divvy the Haggadah up for each one would get the section. So if I had a fight with my brother, I'd always assign to him the evil son. And then, of course, my mother and my grandmother would cook and that kind of deal. And one of the favorite parts was looking for the afikomen. And so I would always, my brothers and I always compete. And unfortunately, my brothers usually found it. I think I only found it once. But there was, just a great family time. But we would only get to the meal, by the way. We never got, rarely, maybe not never, but rarely get to the part after the meal. So you get to the meal and that's over.
That is interesting. That's true. I don't remember. I don't have a lot of memories of after the meal.
Yeah.
I do have one of the biggest tragedies that ever took place for me on Passover was that I spotted the afikoman and I pointed to it, and the girl that was looking next to me saw where I was pointing and she grabbed it. I lost $5. My grandfather was going to give me $5. I lost it all.
So here's the question. How was it for you?
So again, interesting, because I remember the same thing when we went to my grandparents' house. My papa one night, my grandpa the other. 3, 4, 5 hour seders. But after we ate, I don't think we ever came back and did the last 2 cups of wine. We do that all the time, obviously in the Messianic Seder, because that points to the blood and body of Yeshua. But I don't remember growing up if my family ever did the cups of wine after dinner, because in a sense, all of the elements are eaten beforehand and you have the big meal and drinking the 2 cups of wine afterwards. It's not a big deal. If you're Orthodox, you probably do, okay? But even though my grandparents were Orthodox, kept kosher, I'm like Seth, I don't remember us drinking cups of wine and being called back to the table, other than the fact that we would find the afikomen.
So it's not that like you conked out as a child. It's like the family didn't emphasize the last 2 cups.
Yeah, you find the afikomen, and if you ask me if I remember if we took the afikomen with the cup of wine, I don't. We very well might have. My grandparents were Orthodox. We very well might have, because finding the afikomen is big for kids, because you want to get the money. So, but it's interesting that he mentioned
Once you have
that too.
become a follower of Yeshua and then you celebrated the Passover Seder, was that any different?
Absolutely. I remember actually the day after I'd come to faith in Yeshua, and it was suddenly like he was looking at me the whole time and I never saw him. Kind of like Magic Eye. I don't remember the posters where he stared into those posters, the 3D posters.
Yeah.
And if you caught things just right, there was a picture underneath. And it was suddenly like, why hadn't I seen Jesus everywhere before? But then celebrating Passover and seeing the breaking of the matzah, taking the 3rd cup, reading about Yeshua washing the disciples' feet, and then seeing a picture of my grandfather and thinking that's exactly what Yeshua did. And it was like, how in the world did I celebrate the Passover all my life? One of the most clear expressions of what Jesus did, the breaking of his body, the Lamb of God. How is it that it was so clear and I didn't see it?
Yeah, for me, it's like for more than 20 years, I was flying in an automatic pilot, through the holidays. And when Yeshua saved me, I saw the substance. I saw what it's all about. It's like he took the wheel, but it's like the wheel was in his hands the whole time. When I thought I'm an automatic pilot, but it was, and it's amazing because for the first time you see what's the purpose of the holiday, and who is the purpose of the holiday. And it's not me, and it's not the kibbutz. With all due respect, it's the Messiah.
And, and I can very much resonate. I mean, it was very much like that for me as well. All of a sudden, it kind of comes alive and everything has a meaning. And you say, wow, I've done this, like you say, on automatic pilot, for all those years, and it's right there. It's not hinting it, it's like shouting it. And I think in some way, our experience is perhaps a shadow for the day that not as individual, but as a nation, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel will see the one whom we have pierced and get it.
There's another Orthodox, religious Jewish Orthodox, he's a doctor, he's not a rabbi, he's a scholar, but he says, God took us out of Egypt, brought us to Israel. God is taking the Jewish people from all nations, bringing them, praise the Lord, now to Israel. He said, but Israel is still in a spiritual galut, exile. Israel is still, and he's waiting. A religious Jew scholar, he's waiting for Israel we came physically to the land. Now he's looking for a second Passover, you can say, when we're going to be spiritually back in the land. And I think only through Yeshua, you can bring us back to the spiritual land, to where we belong.
Amen.
They call matzah lechem ani.
Mm-hmm. Oh, lechem oni, yeah.
Lechem oni, right? The
Like,
bread of the afflicted.
Poverty, yeah.
But or afflicted,
Right.
right? So you've got the word in Hebrew for affliction is la'anot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting, Zechariah 9:9. I've recently been studying this passage where it says that he comes righteous, and the English translates it humble.
Was it Ani?
But it's the word there
Yeah, same one.
is the word for afflicted. In other words, you already have the intimation of in Zechariah 9:9 of the coming of a Messiah who's afflicted. And then it says, again in the English says, and bearing salvation, but the Hebrew there says, and saved. In other words, you have a delivered Messiah, which intimates on the fact that the Messiah is going to be delivered. He's going to suffer. And then you have this presentation, Zechariah 12, of looking on him whom they've pierced. Zechariah 14, of this new Passover, this day is going to come where one day our people, I think, are going to realize, wow, Jesus has been right in front of us the whole time. And they'll finally be able to see him.
So in this article, Professor Yuval is quoting halachmania, the bread of affliction. He's saying, you know where the first mention of the bread of affliction? That's when Yeshua said, "This is my body given." He's quoting the Last Supper from Matthew and Luke. Professor Yuval is saying that's the first bread of affliction that we know of, the first historical record of the bread of affliction. And of course, we see it in the Haggadah later. By the way, Professor Yuval is saying he thinks the whole Gospel of Mark was the Messianic Haggadah, for which the rabbis gave a counterpart, substitution. Yeah. So he said he believes Mark was read as the Passover Haggadah for the Messianic Jews. And the rabbis came up with their own Haggadah. Actually, he says the oral law is a tguva, reaction
Response
for the New Testament, the whole oral law. That's how he ends the article.
So the oral law is a replacement theology.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I wish you.
All right, so
Wow.
I thought that was worth watching because there's a lot of new information even for me. We got obviously some of the best Hebrew Messianic scholars. They're all doctors. They teach theology over in Israel. They brought up some very, very interesting points that it was so good for me to see the connection on some things that I wanted you guys to see it too, so that when we jump into the New Testament, I hope that you'll see you know, when we start looking and connecting all the dots, that we're not making it all up, we're acting within what other writers have done for a long time. But even the last point, you know, interesting, where the rabbi says the matzah is just called unleavened in the Old Testament. It's not called the bread of affliction. He says the first in the Haggadah today, all the Jewish people, when you take it out of the bag, this is the bread of affliction. And that's why we break it. Because out of affliction came salvation. And that professor was saying the first time that the Jewish people ever made the connection of the bread to affliction is, guess where? In the New Testament, when Jesus said, "This is my body." So it's just fantastic. And then I've never heard of the fact that the whole Gospel of Mark is actually the Haggadah for Messianic, and they come up with their own, and obviously now connecting all the dots to Rabbinic Judaism through the oral traditions. So I hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was very appropriate. I thought that there was a lot of good connections there that hopefully you'll, when you do a Seder or you go to one, you'll see it in a different vein, and that should set up our time in the New Testament, because they brought up some very good points. So any discussion before we leave for the evening? Anything that grabbed you? Anything that was like, wow, I never thought about that before?
Only one thought that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the Passover being coming out of slavery to Egypt, the coming of Yeshua and the Last Supper being a Passover. He is taking us out of slavery to sin, at least positionally. And when he finally comes, he really takes us out of slavery to sin completely.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, obviously you can see the story of Jesus. Abraham goes down to Egypt. Moses goes down to Egypt. Jesus goes down to Egypt. You see that they made that Abraham, Moses, Jesus connection so profound that there's, okay, so Moses was spared from Pharaoh killing him. Jesus was spared from Herod killing him, okay? Moses obviously is raised in Egypt. Yeshua obviously for a couple of years was in Egypt. Then he comes out, Abraham comes out, Moses comes out, and you know, Deuteronomy 18:18 is a very, very classical rabbinic commentary on the text that says that, behold, one like me, this is Moses speaking, one of your countrymen will come later on who will be greater than me. So in a sense, the Messiah will be a greater Moses, because what he did the first time was just a prelude of what the Messiah will do this time. So there's all sorts of connections. Now, look, the question is, did the rabbis take Moses out of the Haggadah so that we don't have a right to put Jesus in the Haggadah? Not, I don't know, because nobody knows why Moses isn't mentioned at all in the Haggadah. Once. Where in the Bible, he's obviously mentioned thousands of times. So it is fascinating to know why. And again, we don't know why, because the earliest Haggadah we have in the Jewish world is 600 AD. So that comes way after Jesus, way after the Talmud is certified in 450. You know, it just, we don't know why some of these things. So, all righty.
Hey, Mitch,
Yeah.
I thought a couple of things that really stood out to me that I had never thought of before. And one was that Lot served unleavened bread to the two angels, pointing to like, I thought that was really cool. I'd never heard that before. And the other one was that Abraham took Isaac on the 14th of Nisan, which is, it's like a pre-incarnate Passover, pointing in both of them. I thought that was really cool.
Yep. And you got to be careful, Angel, when you read, like he was pulling out passages that would help us understand the connection, correct? You could probably read other passages that would connect Abraham to Rosh Hashanah. Now, the question is, what is
Oh, okay.
the truth?
Okay.
There is no truth, because in Judaism, both can be true at the same time, because one rabbi says this, the other rabbi says that, they both are true. Because we're not really sure. So, but the fact that there are rabbis connecting Abraham, Isaiah connecting Isaiah 53 to the Passover, I mean, it's not, it's no secret that the whole coming of the Messiah for Jewish people in the future will be very much like the first time. So there's no, that's not a secret. The fact that Jesus died on Passover, again, isn't it amazing to think that God set everything up for Jesus to die at Passover? Amazing. It's not a coincidence. It's the predetermined plan of God, as Peter preaches in Acts. Right? And I'll leave you on this note. He will die on Passover. He will be buried on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then he's resurrected. Easter, or Day of Resurrection, is a Jewish holiday called First Fruits. So it's self-contained. The first three holidays is the death, burial, and resurrection of our Messiah. And it's not a coincidence. It's what God always wanted and intended for us to believe.
And it's the head of the year.
Well, it's the biblical head of the year, right? In the month of Nisan, it's the biblical head. And Rosh Hashanah is the, what we would call the ceremonial or the community head. But you're right. So, alrighty. So I hope you enjoyed that. Next week, we will then now jump into now the introduction to a new study. So, Teresa, it's good to see you here.
Thanks.
Can I ask you to pray for our time together, and we'll see everybody next week?
Of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Lord, I just thank you for this study. I thank you for how even the video from One for Israel, it just points to the depth of your word and how every word has a purpose. And Lord, as we take the time to really study it, it just magnifies and glorifies who you are and your plan for redemption. And I do thank you for this week. Just, Lord, encourage us to just share the gospel, share the truth of what we know and what you have opened our eyes to those around us. And we just pray, Lord, for all the Passover Seders that are taking place right now, that you will be glorified. This is your purpose. This is your plan. So you would be glorified as people take this both in Messianic congregations, the churches, and throughout the United States and worldwide. So thank you for Mitch and everybody present. And we just pray, Yeshua, that you will continue to sanctify us and to help us glorify your great name. And we pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. Have a great
Have a great
Pesach,
next
and I'll
week.
see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.